Arizona Territory. 1874. The sun was high, the air dry as bone, and the market square in Prescott buzzed with heat and voices. Marabeth Lowell pressed her basket tighter to her chest as she weaved through the crowd, her boots kicking up dust. She kept her chin high, though her dress was patched, her sleeves sun-bleached thin. Every coin she had was tucked inside the hem of her skirt, stitched in place, because she did not trust anyone anymore, not after what happened back in Kansas. Not after she buried her father and arrived here with nothing but a mule and a worn-out Bible. She had come to sell hand-stitched cloth and buy a little flour, hoping to stretch her last sack of beans another week. But just as she reached the vegetable stall, a woman's sharp voice cut through the crowd. "Move, girl. You are in the way." Marabeth turned toward the voice, barely registering the haughty tilt of the woman's lace-trimmed hat before a hand shoved hard against her chest. Her basket flew. She stumbled backward, feet slipping. She fell straight into the mud. The crowd didn't stop. Some chuckled. Others looked away. Her face flushed hot as her hands sank into the thick, wet ground beneath her. Her skirt soaked through, her pride shattered. She blinked up, heart pounding. The woman who'd pushed her was already walking away, not even sparing a glance. Then a shadow stepped between her and the sun. A hand reached down. "Get up," said a voice. Low, calm, not laughing, not mocking. "I'll take her." Marabeth stared. The hand was large, calloused, steady. Its owner was a tall man with broad shoulders, a dust-covered hat pulled low over his eyes and a rifle slung across his back. His coat was worn, but the way he stood made it seem like he owned the very dirt beneath them. "I what?" she asked, dazed. He didn't repeat himself. He just offered his hand again, patient, so she took it. He pulled her to her feet like she weighed nothing. Her skirts clung to her legs, mud dripping. She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand and looked up at him, her breath catching. The man tipped his hat back. His eyes were a stormy gray, his jaw lined with days of stubble. He was young, mid-20s, maybe, but there was a weight behind his eyes that told her he had seen battlefields and buried friends. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice shook and her palms stung. He looked past her toward the crowd. "Some people forget their manners." Marabeth stared at him. "You do not even know me." "Name's Holden Zayne," he said, matter of fact. "And I reckon you needed someone to say something." She blinked. "Marabeth Lowell," he nodded once. "All right, Marabeth Lowell. Let's get you out of this mess." Holden led her away from the market, not demanding anything, not asking questions, just walking beside her, a quiet steadiness in his stride. They stopped near a public water trough where she could rinse her hands and wring out her sleeves. She glanced at him, wary. "Why did you help me?" He leaned against the hitching post, arms crossed. "Most would not have. That is reason enough." She studied him. "You from around here?" "No," Holden said, "just passing through. Looking for land to settle." "You have family?" "Had," he said simply. "Union took my brother, fever took my mother, war took the rest." Marabeth swallowed hard. "I lost mine too, my father last winter." He nodded like he understood. "Hard thing. Losing the ones who made you." There was silence between them, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind that let your heart breathe. She looked up at him. "You really said you'd take me?" Holden looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "I did." "Why?" He shrugged. "Felt right." A long pause stretched between them, then he tilted his head. "You got somewhere to go?" "I rent a single room behind the blacksmith's barn," she said. "Not much, but it is dry." Holden's eyes flicked to the sky. "Storm's coming." She nodded. "I noticed." "Let me walk you there," he said. "Not proper to leave a lady after pulling her from the mud." Marabeth hesitated, but something about him made her want to say yes. All right. They walked side by side through the dusty lanes, past saloons and shuttered windows. She noticed the way he watched everything around them, not nervously, but like a man who had learned not to be surprised by danger. They reached the barn. The door creaked as she opened it and stepped inside. Her little cot was tucked in the corner, a small fire pit dug into the dirt beside it. She turned to face him. "Thank you, Holden," he nodded. "Do you need anything?" Marabeth looked down at her ruined dress. "Just a new start," he smiled. Not wide, not bold, but warm and real. "I might be staying in town a few days," he said. "Maybe I will see you again." "I'd like that," she said, then paused. "I mean, if you want to, I do," he said, and tipped his hat. He left her there, heart fluttering like it had not in months. She watched him go, feeling something shift deep inside her. Like maybe the worst of it was behind her. Like maybe, just maybe, something good was finally on its way. The storm came at dusk. Marabeth stood just inside the barn's side door, fingers curled around the edge, watching the wind sweep dust across the yard. The mule in the next stall shifted nervously, ears flicking with each gust. Thunder rolled distant and low, like a wagon wheel on far-off stones. She dried her skirt as best she could by the fire pit's coals, but the damp clung to her skin. The warmth from Holden's hand still lingered in her memory, but she didn't let herself get carried away. One man's kindness wasn't a promise. The next morning broke cold and clean. The wind had scrubbed the sky pale blue, and the air smelled of wet wood and iron. Marabeth stepped outside, brushing straw from her sleeves, and found Holden leaning against the fence post near the water trough, a biscuit in one hand and his rifle slung across his shoulder. "You always turn up without a sound?" she asked, narrowing her eyes just a little. He glanced over. "Only when I've got something worth showing." She tilted her head. "That's so." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. "Land agents riding in from Ash Fork. He's bringing maps. I was thinking of buying a parcel west near the Juniper Flats. But I don't read these hand-drawn plats too well." She crossed her arms. "You want me to come interpret some maps?" "I want your opinion," he said. "You've got sense, and I figure you'd know how to tell good soil from dry." Marabeth raised an eyebrow. "You assume a lot about a girl you met in the mud." His mouth twitched just once. "I see things as they are." She considered him. "All right, I'll come, but I'm not doing it for free." "What's your price?" "You bring me half a sack of cornmeal before sundown." Holden nodded, pleased. "Done." They walked through town together, keeping a quiet pace. Children dashed past with sticks and tin pails, and a pair of soldiers leaned outside the telegraph office smoking rolled tobacco. The boarding house's laundry flapped on the line like pale flags. Outside the livery where the land agent waited, Holden stopped short. "I haven't said much about it," he said, looking straight ahead, "but I came west hoping to make something that lasts. Not just a patch of dirt, something real, something I can hold on to." Marabeth didn't speak right away. Then she said, "I only trust what a man does, not what he says." "Fair enough." The land agent was a wiry man with ink-stained cuffs and a sunburned neck. He laid out the maps on a barrel top, weighting each corner with stones. Holden stood close enough that she could see the scar along his jaw, a faint line, half hidden beneath stubble, like a memory that hadn't faded all the way. She leaned over the parchment, tracing the ridge lines and creek beds with her fingertip. "This one," she said at last, tapping a square near the edge of the map, "has runoff from the high stones and it's sheltered from wind. You plant corn there, it'll stay standing." Holden studied the spot. "And if I build there, you'll need timber. And a well dug deep." "I can do both." She stepped back. "Then it's a good place, but you'll be alone out there." He met her eyes. "Maybe not." A silence passed, but this one felt different, not like before. This one held weight. She cleared her throat. "I should get back. That cornmeal won't find its way to my shelf by itself." Holden nodded and handed the land agent a few coins before folding the map into his coat. Then he fell into step beside her, matching her pace. By the time they reached the barn, the sun was high and the dust on the road had dried to fine powder. He handed her a cloth sack tied with twine. "Not just cornmeal," he said. "There's salt and a little lard, too." She blinked. "You didn't have to." "I did," he said simply. She stepped back into the barn and turned to face him. "You planning on building that home?" "I am." "When?" "Soon as the frost pulls back from the ground." Another pause. She looked down at her calloused hands. "I've been on my own a long time. I don't make room easy." "I know," he said. "But I don't rattle easy either." She glanced up, and this time she didn't look away. "You'll need help out there." "I was hoping you'd say that." No promises, no declarations, just a quiet moment hanging between them like the hush before a hymn. Holden's boots left shallow impressions in the thaw-softened earth as he paced the edge of the claim. Marabeth stood nearby, her skirt caught in the breeze, watching the way his shoulders squared as he surveyed the land. The map had stayed folded in his coat pocket, but the boundaries were already etched clear in his mind. "You ever split a pine beam by hand?" she asked, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. He glanced over. "Plenty." "You?" "My father taught me with a wedge and mallet. If the grain runs straight, it'll split clean. If not, you've got to follow it where it leads." He nodded once. "Ground's like that too. Can't force it." They fell quiet, the wind stirring the scent of juniper and last season's grass. A hawk circled high above, its cry sharp against the open sky. Holden crouched and ran his fingers through a patch of soil near the dry creek. Still damp under the top, might hold a crop if the rains come right. "They'll come," she said. "They don't hurry, but they come." He stood and wiped his palms on his trousers. "I'll start building come next week. Got a man in town said he'd sell me a pair of oxen if I can barter for tack." Marabeth looked toward the distant ridge. "That's a long way to haul timber. I'll manage. Might take longer doing it myself, but I trust my own hands." She turned to face him. "You don't have to do it alone." Holden held her gaze. "I'd want you there because it's yours too, not because you feel beholden." "I don't feel beholden," she said. "I feel steady when I'm with you." He let out a breath, slow. "That's rare." "I know." They walked back toward town as the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the brush. A rider passed them, heading out toward the mining camps, his horse lathered from the climb. They stepped aside, and Holden tipped his hat in acknowledgement, his other hand resting near the haft of the small axe strapped to his saddle blanket. "Didn't think I'd be making a life again," he said after a while. "Not really. Figured I'd keep moving till something broke. I used to think I'd end up behind someone else's stove, wearing someone else's apron, quiet and small. And now," Marabeth looked at the road ahead, "now I know I'd rather build something with my own hands, even if it's rough. Even if it takes all I've got." They reached her barn just as the last light stretched gold across the hills. She stopped at the door, fingers resting against the frame. "You hungry?" she asked. "I am," he said. "But only if there's enough." "There's always enough for someone who stood beside me when no one else would." He followed her inside, ducking under the low lintel. The coals in her fire pit still glowed faintly, and she set a kettle to warm while he fetched a bundle of kindling from the corner. As the fire caught, she knelt beside it and stirred a pot of beans, adding a pinch of dried sage. He sat nearby, stretching out his legs, his back pressed to the wall. "I've got a ledger," she said. "From my father. He wrote down every planting and every harvest. Even back in Kansas. You keep it close, in my trunk. I read it sometimes when I'm not sure what comes next." He nodded. "My brother used to carve his name into fence rails, said it made the land remember him." She smiled faintly. "Maybe we'll carve our names into the door frame." When the house is built. He looked at her, something tender settling behind his eyes. I'd like that. The kettle began to hiss, and she poured water into 2 tin cups. They ate in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because the quiet felt earned. Outside, the wind moved gently through the rafters. When they finished, she set the cups aside and turned toward him. You'll be out there alone until the roof's on. I'll manage. You'll need help raising the beams. I was hoping you'd offer. She didn't answer right away, only reached for her shawl and draped it across her shoulders. I'll come, she said. Not because I owe you, but because I want to see it rise. The walls, the hearth, all of it. I want to build it with you. Holden stood and crossed the small space between them. He didn't touch her, but the distance between them disappeared all the same. I've known you just a little while, he said, voice low, but it feels like I've been waiting longer. She looked up at him, the firelight catching in her eyes. You've waited long enough, and when he reached for her hand, she let him. The first beam lifted under a pale morning sky. Holden braced his shoulder beneath it, grit in his teeth, while Marabeth steadied the far end with a length of rawhide looped around a forked post. The timber groaned as it rose, but it held. She shoved a wedge beneath the weight and stepped back, brushing sweat from her brow with a forearm streaked in sawdust. You sure it's square? She asked. Holden leaned back, eyeing the angle. Close enough you won't feel the wind through it. She nodded and reached for the mallet. Then we keep going. Each day brought another length of wall, another rafter notched and lifted. The ground around the cabin turned to churned dust and pine chips, and their hands grew stiff with blisters that opened and hardened without complaint. They spoke little while working, only what was needed to heave or hammer or brace. But in the evenings, when the tools were stowed and the cabin's shape had darkened into the dusk, their words came lighter. One night, with the fire just catching in the stone ring Holden had laid by hand, Marabeth sat on an overturned crate and watched the flames flicker up through the iron kettle's bottom. You ever think you'd have this? She asked. A place that's yours. Something no one can take. He poked at the fire with a branch. Didn't think much past the next camp for a long time, but some part of me must have been waiting for it, waiting for something that felt solid. She folded her arms. I used to think solid meant safe, but I've seen safe places burn. Now I think it just means you choose to stay when it's hard. I reckon that's what I'm doing. She tilted her head. With me or with the land? Both, he said without hesitation. The kettle hissed, and they ate in silence, sharing the last of the dried venison she'd traded for a spool of linen thread. When the stars came out, she lay back against her bedroll and listened to the wind slip through the tall grass beyond the half-framed walls. By the third week, the rafters were set. Marabeth stood atop the roofline, knees straddling the beam as Holden passed up planks one by one. Her braid was tied back with a red calico ribbon she'd worn only once before and never for work. You pick that on purpose, he called up, eyes squinting against the sun. She didn't turn. It doesn't catch on nails. Looks good just the same. She paused, then kept hammering. That night they didn't build a fire. Instead, they sat on the edge of the porch frame, boots dangling above the packed earth, and watched the moon rise full over the ridge. Holden rolled a pebble between his fingers, then let it fall. I sent a letter to the supply depot down in Skull Valley, he said. Asked after a stove and a grindstone. She raised an eyebrow. You think we'll have coin for both? I bartered out 3 pelts and a coil of fence wire. They'll throw in a sack of barley if I take the wagon down myself. She watched him for a moment. You're planning farther ahead than I expected. I'm not planning alone, he said. Marabeth didn't answer, but she leaned her shoulder lightly against his. He didn't move. When the roof was finished and the door hung straight on its hinges, They stood together in the center of the single room, sunlight slanting through the open window. Holden took off his hat and held it against his chest. "You think it'll hold through winter?" he asked. She looked up at the beams, at the way the corners met clean. "It'll hold." He turned toward her, voice low. "I want you here, not just for planting, not just for work." She didn't step back. "I know. I'd marry you proper come fall if you'll have me." She looked at him, steady as ever. "I'd say yes," she said, "but I already chose to stay." He reached for her hand, and this time she laced her fingers through his. The door swung open behind them with the breeze, and the house filled with light. The first frost came early, silvering the fields just before dawn. Marabeth laid her palm against the inside of the window and felt the cold through the glass Holden had bartered from a wagoner who'd hauled it up from Tucson. The pane was wavy and imperfect, but it let in light, and that mattered more. Holden was out by the barn, hammering a slat back into place where the wind had pulled it loose. She watched from the kitchen corner, where the new iron stove radiated steady warmth. The scent of yeast and roasted squash lingered in the air. Her boots were drying by the hearth, and her apron was dusted with flour too fine to bother brushing off. They'd been living together for nearly a month, and the rhythm of it had settled around them like a well-worn coat. She rose early to light the stove while he poured water for the animals. He cleaned the tools while she mended seams and hemmed curtains from old feed sacks. There were no grand declarations, just the quiet fact of their days running together, stitched like a seam too strong to pull apart. When he came in, he stamped the cold from his boots and set his gloves on the table. She handed him a tin mug with both hands. "Anything broken?" she asked. "Just the latch," he said, then lifted the mug to his mouth. "You made this, started it yesterday. Let it rise overnight." He nodded, took another sip, then leaned against the table and looked at her differently than usual, not searching, not testing, just looking like he was letting in something he hadn't dared before. "I got a letter," he said, setting the mug down. "From the post rider. One of the boys I served with Lee Carver, he's running cattle out of Wickenburg now. Asked if I'd help him drive a herd come spring." She folded her arms, watching him. "You thinking of going?" I told him no. "Why?" "Because I built this place with you," he said, "and I won't walk away from it." "Or you." She stepped closer, her hands still dusted with flour. "You don't owe me for staying." "I know," he said. "That's why it matters." She reached for his hand, the one not holding the mug. "I never thought I'd want someone beside me day in and day out. But this," she glanced around the room, "this feels like something I never knew I needed." He drew her in, slow, like he was still learning what it meant to touch someone without urgency. One arm around her waist, her head against his collarbone, the silence between them filled with the sound of the stove ticking as it cooled. Outside, the light shifted. The wind picked up again. By late afternoon, Holden had walked to town to pick up the final deed papers, leaving Marabeth alone in the cabin. She took the opportunity to set the table with the best. She had a cloth square of blue muslin, 2 pewter plates, and a sprig of juniper laid beside the bread knife. Her hands moved easily, her mind far off and quiet. When he returned, dusk had begun to fall in streaks of amber through the window. He set the papers on the mantel without comment and turned toward her. "It's official," he said. "The land's in both our names." She looked up from where she was ladling stew into the bowl. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," he said. "This place is yours as much as mine." "Then we'll keep it together," she said, setting the bowl down and folding her hands in her lap. They ate with their sleeves rolled back, knees touching beneath the table. Afterward, she cleared the dishes while he added a log to the fire. The light flickered against the walls, not yet paneled but strong and dry. He stepped behind her, slid his arms around her waist, and murmured, Marry me now. She turned in his arms. We already agreed on fall. I don't want to wait, he said. I've waded through war and loss and every kind of silence. I want to wake up tomorrow and know you're mine by name, not just by choice. Marabeth looked at him, her breath catching not from surprise but from the simple truth of it. Then we'll speak our vows here, tonight. They stood before the fire, her hand in his, and spoke the words soft and sure. No preacher, no paper, just promises spoken with the weight of everything they had built. When he kissed her, it was not tentative, it was whole. They lay down that night with the wind still rustling through the eaves, the fire a soft glow at their feet. Wrapped beneath the quilt she'd pieced from old scraps, she rested her head against his chest. I've never felt safer than I do here, she whispered. You never have to walk alone again, he said. Years passed and the land held. The cabin grew one room added when the barley harvest brought in enough to trade for lumber. A cradle built from leftover pine stood near the hearth. Marabeth taught their daughter to string beans along the fence line and showed her how to read the weather in the shape of the clouds. Holden taught her to ride and to listen before she spoke. They named her Clara, after the only name in Marabeth's family Bible that hadn't been crossed off in ink and grief. Holden never left for the cattle drives. Marabeth never returned to the town lodgings behind the blacksmith. They planted in spring, harvested in summer, and stacked wood in the fall. At night, they sat by the fire and read aloud from her father's ledger, now filled with new notations in Holden's neat hand. The land never made them rich, but it gave them everything they needed. And always, when the wind rose, they stood together on the porch, arms around each other, watching the sky, unafraid.